She stepped into the wrong elevator on her wedding day. The Korean Mafia boss inside pressed the button and said, "You're staying." Seo-Rin Veil ducked into the private lift at 9:14 a.m., her lungs burning and her lace veil snagged on the door as it hissed shut. In exactly 5 minutes, her father's security team would burst into the bridal suite and find it empty. In exactly 10 minutes, the conglomerate heir she was supposed to marry would put a fist through a mahogany wall in a fit of drug-fueled rage. In exactly 1 hour, Seo-Rin would be standing on the rooftop of a high-rise fortress, looking down at the city she'd tried to flee, held captive by a man who was more dangerous than the life she was running from. But she didn't know any of that yet. Right now, she was leaning against the cold, brushed steel of the elevator, her heart thundering against her ribs. She looked at the man standing by the control panel, sharp jaw, dark hair, and a suit that cost more than her wedding. He looked back with an expression of bored, lethal authority. "Service exit," she gasped, her hands shaking as she clutched her white skirt. "Please, my father, he's coming." It wasn't just the unwanted marriage or the corrupt merger her father had brokered. It was the gilded victim, life she had been living since she was born, a woman sold as a transaction, a mind valued only for the name it carried. Her entire life had been an exercise in being a doll, a pretty thing to be traded. She slipped away when the makeup artist turned her back, fleeing the scent of lilies and the suffocating pressure of a life that wasn't hers. She had seen the elevator doors opening and dived inside, a final, desperate bid for agency. She watched the man's gloved finger hover over the buttons. Relief flickered in her chest as she waited for the L for lobby to glow. Instead, his hand moved higher. He pressed the button for the penthouse. The elevator lurched upward, leaving her stomach behind. "I called for a service exit," Seo-Rin breathed, her voice cracking as the floor indicator began its rapid climb. Han Di-jin turned fully to face her, his gaze clinical as it swept over her white lace and the bruises on her wrists she thought she'd hidden. "You made a mistake, little bride," he said, his voice a low, cold rumble that made the air in the narrow space feel even thinner. "The exit is down. We are going up." The lift climbed in a silence so heavy it felt, as though the oxygen was being sucked out of the small, steel box. Seo-Rin stood pressed against the corner, her fingers white-knuckled as they bunched the expensive French lace of her skirts. Above them, the floor indicator flickered past the 40th, 50th, and 60th floors with a rhythmic ping that sounded like a funeral knell for her freedom. She risked a glance at Han Di-jin. He stood with his back to her, a silhouette of obsidian against the brushed metal, his shoulders broad and immovable. He didn't look like a man who had just kidnapped a bride. He looked like a king returning to a throne. When the doors finally slid open, they didn't reveal a lobby or a street where she could vanish into the Seoul crowds. Instead, she was met by a wall of floor-to-ceiling glass that looked out over the sprawling, hazy horizon of the Han River. This was a fortress of marble and shadow, a penthouse that felt more like a sanctuary and a prison all at once. Di-jin stepped out and didn't look back, but the weight of his command remained. "Follow," he said, the single word cutting through her panic like a blade. Seo-Rin stumbled after him, her long train snagging on the polished obsidian floors. As they moved deeper into the residence, she saw men in dark suits, silent, granite-faced sentries who bowed as Di-jin passed, but whose eyes tracked her with the predatory curiosity of wolves. Panic flared in her chest again. She turned, looking for the door they had just entered, but the elevator was already gone, and the only other exit was blocked by a man the size of a mountain who stared at her with a look of bored inevitability. "You can't do this," Seo-Rin breathed, her voice echoing in the vast, hollow space of the living area. "My father will pay whatever you want. Just let me go before the ceremony starts." Di-jin stopped and turned. The late morning sun hit the sharp, carved lines of his face, making his dark eyes look like polished flint. He walked toward her, his pace slow and measured, until she was forced to retreat against a cold marble pillar. He reached out, not to strike, but to catch her chin with a thumb and forefinger, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Your father sold you for a merger to a man who would have broken you within a month," he said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register. "You ran from that cage because you wanted to live. I'm simply giving you a better one." He let her go, his touch leaving a trail of fire on her skin that made her heart skip a traitorous beat. The wedding is over, Seo-Rin. The Veils and the Kwons are currently tearing the hotel apart looking for you, but they will never find you here. He gestured to the sprawling view of the city below, a world she was no longer a part of. From this moment on, you do not exist to them. You belong to the high-rise now. You belong to me. The heavy silence of the penthouse was broken by the rhythmic tap of a cane against the marble floor. Seo-Rin, still trembling from Dijin's declaration, turned to see a small, silver-haired woman approaching from the shadows of the hallway. She was dressed in a traditional silk hanbok of deep violet, her face a map of elegant wrinkles and sharp, observant eyes. This was the matriarch of the Han Empire, the legendary Halmione. Behind her, the massive guard named Marco bowed low, his usual bored expression replaced by profound reverence. Seo-Rin braced herself for an interrogation or a cold dismissal, but the old woman stopped and simply smiled, her eyes crinkling with genuine warmth. "Dijin, you finally brought a girl home on your wedding day," the Halmione said, her voice carrying a rasp of age but the weight of absolute authority. She moved towards Seo-Rin, ignoring her grandson entirely, and reached out with warm, calloused fingers to cup the bride's pale face. "Look at these eyes. They are full of spirit, like a caged bird finally tasting the wind." Seo-Rin flinched, her voice cracking as she tried to maintain her defense. "I'm not his girlfriend. I was kidnapped. I am a Veil, and my father will." The Halmione let out a soft, delighted laugh, cutting Seo-Rin off as she pinched the girl's cheek with enough strength to sting. "So modest, and such spirit. My grandchildren will be warriors with a mother like you." Seo-Rin gasped, looking desperately at Dijin, who stood by the window like a statue of stone, refusing to intervene. "Grandchildren? I thought he was just a criminal. He took me from my own wedding." The Halmione leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper loud enough for the guards to hear. "The Han men are intense, Tesoro. His father kidnapped me too, you know. They call it aggressive courting, but we know better. It's passionate." Confusion swirled in Seo-Rin's mind, sharper than the fear. She had expected a dungeon or a cold interrogation room, not an eccentric grandmother discussing romantic kidnapping. "You don't understand," Seo-Rin pleaded, gesturing to her ruined white lace. "I am a transaction. I have no value beyond the merger." The Halmione's expression shifted, the manic energy fatting into something fierce and protective. She pulled Seo-Rin into a crushing, maternal hug that smelled of ginger and expensive tea. "You have family now, whether you want us or not. You ate my grandson's time, and in this house, that makes you ours." As the old woman began steering her toward the dining hall, humming a tune that sounded disturbingly like a wedding march, Seo-Rin felt the gilded cage of her life shifting. She looked back at Dijin, who was watching them with those unreadable, ice-blue eyes. He wasn't mocking her, and he wasn't angry. He was looking at her as if he were cataloging every detail of her soul. "Eat first," the Halmione commanded, patting Seo-Rin's hand firmly. "Then we talk about the wedding." The words hit Seo-Rin like ice water, but for the first time in her life, she didn't feel invisible. The dining hall was vast, filled with the scent of pine and aged tea, but the warmth of the Halmione's welcome couldn't quite reach the chill in Seo-Rin's bones. She sat at the long obsidian table, her fingers tracing the delicate patterns of the silverware, her mind still reeling from the surreal hospitality of a Mafia matriarch. Across the table, Han Dijin sat in a silence that felt heavy and expectant. He hadn't touched his food. He was watching her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. The Halmione had retreated to the kitchen to oversee the final courses, leaving them alone in the flickering candlelight. Seo-Rin reached for a glass of water, her movements stiff and guarded. As she lifted the crystal, the wide lace sleeve of her wedding gown slipped back, revealing the dark, mottled skin of her wrist. The bruises were shaped like fingers, the ugly, purple remnants of her fiancé's parting grip when she had tried to pull away from him that morning. Dijin's fork hit the table with a sharp, metallic ring. Before she could pull her sleeve down, he was out of his chair. He moved with a predatory speed that stole the air from the room, crossing the distance between them in 2 long strides. He didn't ask. He simply reached down and caught her hand, his fingers surprisingly gentle as he turned her wrist over into the light. The ice that usually defined Han Dijin's expression didn't just melt, it shattered. Seo-Rin watched as a vein in his temple began to throb, his jaw tightening until the bones seemed ready to snap. His eyes, usually a frozen, unreadable blue, flared with a dark, protective fury that made the very atmosphere of the room turn electric. "Who did this?" he asked. His voice was no longer the calm rumble of a captor. It was a low, lethal growl that promised violence. "It doesn't matter," Seo-Rin whispered, trying to tug her hand back. "It's just part of the bargain. My father said it was a small price for the merger." Dijin didn't let go. Instead, his thumb brushed the edge of the darkest bruise, his touch feather-light, as if he were afraid he might break her further. The fury in his gaze was so absolute that it terrified her more than her fiancé ever had, yet beneath that fear was a strange, traitorous spark of relief. No one had ever looked at her pain and felt it as their own. "A bargain," he repeated, the word dripping with contempt. He looked up, pinning her with a stare that made her heart hammer against her ribs. "You are not a transaction to be bruised and traded, Seo-Rin, not in this house." He released her wrist, but he didn't step back. He stood over her, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow across the table. The man who had locked the elevator doors to keep her captive was gone, replaced by someone who looked ready to burn the city down just to avenge a mark on her skin. "The Quns think they can put their hands on what is mine," he said, his voice dropping into a deadly, quiet register. "They are about to find out how wrong they are." The white lace dress, once a symbol of her father's ambitions and her fiancé's cruelty, now lay in a heap of ruined silk on the marble floor of the dressing room. Every time Seo-Rin looked at it, she saw the transactional ghost of the woman she was supposed to be. The silence of the penthouse was broken only by the soft slide of a closet door as Han Dijin entered. He didn't look at the discarded gown. His eyes were fixed on the black garment draped over his arm, a silhouette of shadows that seemed to absorb the morning light. "The white was never yours," Dijin said, his voice a low, resonant vibration that seemed to settle in the marrow of her bones. He stepped closer, the scent of sandalwood and cold rain following him. "It was a uniform for a doll. In this house we do not have dolls." He held out the garment. It was a modern reimagining of a hanbok, crafted from heavy midnight black silk with intricate charcoal embroidery along the high collar and wide cuffs. It wasn't just clothing, it was armor. Seo-Rin reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed the cool, expensive fabric. It felt substantial, a weight that promised protection rather than the flimsy vulnerability of the lace. "Why black?" she whispered, her gaze lifting to meet his ice-blue stare. "Because black is the color of authority," he replied, his expression unreadable but his gaze intense. "It is the color of those who do not need to be seen to be feared. You spent your life being invisible in white, Seo-Rin. Today that ends." He reached out, his thumb grazing the pulse point at her throat, a touch that was both a claim and a challenge. "Change. The world downstairs needs to know who you are now." When she finally emerged, the transformation was absolute. The black silk flowed around her like liquid obsidian, the structured shoulders giving her a stature she had never possessed in her father's house. She felt the heavy silk settle against her skin, a physical reminder that the gilded victim had been left behind in the dressing room. As she walked back into the main hall, the guards, men who had previously looked at her with clinical detachment, straightened their posture. Marco bowed, not with the bored inevitability of a jailer, but with the sharp precision of a soldier acknowledging a commander. Dijin was waiting by the glass wall, his hands clasped behind his back. He turned as she approached, and for a fleeting second the predatory stillness of his face shattered. His eyes traveled from her dark hem to the defiant tilt of her chin. He didn't offer a compliment. Men like Dijin didn't deal in flattery. He simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the power she now wore. "The Quns are still looking for a girl in white," he said, stepping into her space until the heat of his body was the only thing she could feel. "Let them look. They will never recognize the woman standing in front of me." The skyline of Seoul was a tapestry of shimmering lights, but inside the penthouse, the atmosphere was thick with a new, jagged tension. Seo-Rin stood by the massive glass walls, her reflection in the midnight black silk of her hanbok, looking back at her with eyes that no longer recognized the frightened bride from the elevator. The silence of the high-rise was usually absolute, a luxury bought with height and reinforced steel. But tonight, the air felt charged, like the moments before a summer storm breaks over the Han River. Di-jin was at his desk, the glow of a tablet illuminating the sharp, predatory lines of his face as he reviewed the forensic evidence Seo-Rin had helped him categorize. He didn't look up, but his voice drifted through the room, low and grounded. "You're packing, Seo-Rin. The glass is reinforced. It can withstand a Category 5 hurricane." "It's not the wind I'm worried about," she whispered, turning to face him. "The elevator I stepped into, the one you locked, it wasn't just a private lift, was it? It was a secure line." Di-jin finally looked up, his ice-blue eyes narrowing. Before he could answer, a muffled thud vibrated through the floor, not from the elevators, but from the service stairwell. In an instant, the graceful stillness of the penthouse vanished. Di-jin was on his feet, a weapon appearing in his hand with a fluid, terrifying speed. "Get behind the desk," he commanded, his voice a lethal rasp. The first shot didn't come from the door. It came from the sky. A high-velocity round shattered the outer pane of the reinforced glass wall, spiderwebbing the transparent barrier, but failing to punch through. Seo-Rin dove for the floor as the room was suddenly bathed in the crimson sweep of laser sights. She realized then, with a sickening jolt of clarity, that the elevator hadn't been an escape route. It had been a bullseye. By stepping into Han Di-jin's private lift, she hadn't just avoided a marriage. She had walked directly into the center of a coordinated assassination attempt. The rival crew wasn't just coming for the boss, they were coming for the fortress he occupied. "Marco, status!" Di-jin barked into a comms unit as he moved with haunting calm toward the shattered glass, returning fire into the darkness of the neighboring rooftop. "Breach on the terrace, boss." Marco's voice crackled through the room over the sound of automatic fire. The glass walls, once her window to a beautiful, distant world, now felt like a transparent cage. Every flash of gunfire from the outside illuminated the room, turning the luxury penthouse into a battlefield of shadows and light. Seo-Rin huddled beneath the heavy mahogany desk, the smell of ozone and gunpowder stinging her nose. She watched Di-jin stand his ground against the onslaught, a silhouette of obsidian and fury. He wasn't just fighting for his life or his empire. He was standing between her and the void. In the chaos, the fear that had defined her life for 24 years finally began to transmute. As the glass groaned under the pressure of another impact, Seo-Rin realized that the wrong elevator had brought her to the only place in the world where people were willing to bleed to keep her safe. The danger was real, but for the first time, she wasn't the victim. She was the prize they were willing to die for. The chaos of the attack retreated into a simmering silence, leaving the penthouse smelling of spent shells and broken glass. The red sweep of the laser sights had vanished with the retreat of the rival crew, and the only light now came from the moon reflecting off the Han River. Seo-Rin emerged from beneath the desk, her black silk hanbok dusted with fine glass shards that glittered like diamonds against the dark fabric. Across the room, Di-jin stood by the fractured window, his silhouette rigid, his chest heaving with the residual adrenaline of the fight. "You should have let them take me," Seo-Rin whispered, her voice trembling as she stood among the wreckage of his sanctuary. "My father, the Kwons, they only want me back to save the merger. If I'm here, they will keep coming. I'm just leverage for them, and I'm a liability for you." Di-jin turned slowly. The predatory fire in his eyes hadn't fully faded, but as he looked at her, something shifted. The lethal boss receded, replaced by a man burdened by a truth he hadn't intended to share. He crossed the room, stepping over the shattered remains of a crystal vase, and didn't stop until he was inches away. The heat radiating from him was a physical force, grounded and intense. "You think I kept you because of a merger?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that vibrated in the quiet air. "You think I locked that elevator because I needed a pawn to play against your father?" He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before his fingers finally settled against her jaw, tilting her head back so she had no choice but to meet his ice-blue gaze. "I was in that hotel for a meeting I didn't want to attend," he admitted, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip. "I saw you through the cracked door of the bridal suite before you ran. You were surrounded by silk, flowers and security, but your eyes, they looked like a guttering candle. You weren't a bride preparing for a wedding. You were a woman preparing for an execution. Seo-Rin felt a lump form in her throat, the breath hitching in her chest. For years, she had felt the life being squeezed out of her by her father's expectations, but she had never imagined that a stranger, let alone a man like Han Di-jin, would see it. "I didn't press that button because I wanted to trap you," he continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt more intimate than a touch. "I pressed it because when you looked at me in that lift, I saw someone who had finally reached her breaking point. I didn't take a hostage, Seo-Rin. I took a woman who was dying in that chapel, and I decided that I wasn't going to let the world finish the job." He let his hand drop, but he didn't move away. In the shadowed ruins of the penthouse, the air between them was no longer filled with the terror of a kidnapping, but with the terrifying weight of being truly seen. "You are my guest," he said, the words a vow. "And in this house, my guests do not die for someone else's profit." The morning after the attack, the penthouse was a hive of silent activity. While crews worked to replace the shattered glass, Seo-Rin found herself drawn to the one room that remained untouched by the chaos, Di-jin's private study. The air inside was cool and smelled of old paper and expensive tobacco. She didn't intend to pry, but the heavy mahogany desk, the same one she had huddled beneath while bullets whistled overhead, seemed to pulse with the secrets of the two worlds currently colliding around her. She noticed a slim, black ledger tucked into a hidden compartment near the floor, partially dislodged by the vibrations of the explosion. Picking it up, she expected to see Di-jin's cold, precise notations of criminal enterprise. Instead, she recognized the frantic, slanted handwriting of her father's chief accountant. This wasn't a Mafia record. It was a shadow file from the Veil Corporation, a duplicate set of books that should never have left her father's private vault. As she turned the pages, her breath hitched. Her forensic mind, sharpened by years of being ignored while she audited the family's charitable foundations, began to connect the dots with terrifying speed. The merger with the Kwon family wasn't just a transaction to gain power. It was a smokescreen. Her father hadn't just sold her to a conglomerate heir. He was using the wedding as a distraction to siphon billions out of the very offshore accounts the Korean Mafia used to move their untraceable assets. The ledger revealed a complex web of betrayal. Her father had been planning a double cross of historic proportions. He intended to let the Kwons and the Hans go to war, wait for the dust to settle, and then vanish with the combined wealth of both organizations. By placing Seo-Rin in the Kwon household, he wasn't just securing a merger, he was planting a scapegoat. When the money disappeared, the Kwons would blame her, and the Mafia would retaliate against a family that no longer had the funds to defend itself. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't just a gilded victim of an unwanted marriage. She was a sacrificial lamb in a heist orchestrated by her own blood. Her father hadn't just bartered her soul. He had signed her death warrant, knowing the Mafia would eventually come for whoever was left standing. The heavy door creaked open, and Di-jin stepped in, his silhouette framed by the morning light. He saw the ledger in her hands, his eyes tracking the way her fingers shook against the leather binding. He didn't move to take it. He simply stood there, waiting for the girl who had been a doll to realize she was holding the weapon that could destroy them all. "You found it," he said, his voice a low, unreadable rumble. "He was going to kill us all," Seo-Rin whispered, her gaze lifting from the pages to meet his ice-blue stare. "Not just the Kwons, you, your family. He was going to take the money and leave me to burn with the rest of you." Di-jin crossed the room, his hand settling on the back of her chair. The heat of him was the only thing keeping her grounded as the world she thought she knew dissolved into a ledger of lies. "Now you know why I pressed the button," he said. "The wrong elevator didn't just save you from a husband, Seo-Rin. It saved you from a father who never intended for you to survive the night." The air in the penthouse had grown cold, weighted by the revelation of the ledger and the looming shadow of a final confrontation. By mid-afternoon, the silent tension was shattered by a secure transmission patch through Di-jin's private line. Seo-Rin stood by the reinforced glass, her black silk hanbok whispering against the floor as she turned to see her father's face flickering on the massive wall monitors. President Vale looked older, his features sharpened by the greed that had finally overreached its grasp. He didn't bother with the facade of paternal concern. Behind him, the city was a powder keg. His private security forces and the jilted Kwon family's enforcers had turned the streets into a war zone, ostensibly searching for the stolen bride, though the ledger revealed it was merely a distraction for his final exit strategy. "You've played a dangerous game, Dijin," her father's voice crackled, devoid of warmth. "But even the Han family cannot withstand a war on 3 fronts. The city is bleeding, and the police are looking for a reason to raid your fortresses. I'm offering a trade. Return my daughter to the Kwon family by midnight, and the peace returns. The Kwons get their bride, I get my merger, and you get to keep your empire intact." The ultimatum hung in the air like a poisoned mist. Seo-Rin felt the old, familiar weight of being a pawn settle onto her shoulders. Her father wasn't asking for her back out of love. He needed her to fulfill the role of the scapegoat so his theft could go unnoticed. Dijin didn't look at the screen. He stood a few feet away from Seo-Rin, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on her. The lethal authority that usually radiated from him was tempered by a strange, quiet stillness. He didn't answer her father. Instead, he stepped toward her, his ice-blue eyes searching hers. "The gates are open, Seo-Rin," Dijin said, his voice a low, steady vibration that cut through her father's static. "My men will not stop you. If you walk out now, the war ends. You go back to the world you knew, and I handle the fallout here." Seo-Rin looked at the monitor, where her father waited with the cold expectation of a man who believed his daughter was still a doll to be moved. Then she looked at Dijin. He wasn't commanding her. He wasn't locking the doors this time. He was offering her the one thing her father never had, a choice. "He's lying, Dijin," she whispered, her voice gaining a strength that made her father's eyes narrow on the screen. "He doesn't want peace. He wants the time to finish what's in that ledger. If I go back, I'm just a body to hide his tracks." Dijin reached out, his hand hovering near hers but not touching, waiting for her to close the gap. "I know he's lying, but I need to know if you still want to run. I told you that you were a guest in this house, and guests are free to leave." Seo-Rin looked at her father one last time, the man who had bartered her soul for a heist. Then, she reached out and laced her fingers through Dijin's, the heat of his palm a stark contrast to the cold life she was leaving behind. "I'm not running anymore," she said, turning her back on the monitor. "Tell him the bride is staying, and tell him I'm bringing the ledger with me." The digital silence of the study was punctuated only by the rapid, rhythmic clicking of Seo-Rin's keyboard. She had traded her lace veil for a high-definition monitor, her eyes reflecting lines of glowing code and shifting spreadsheets instead of the flickering candles of a chapel. Han Dijin stood behind her, a silent shadow of obsidian, his hand resting on the back of her chair as he watched the doll he had rescued dismantle an empire with surgical precision. "They think they're invisible because they use ghost accounts," Seo-Rin whispered, her voice tight with a cold, intellectual fury. "But every ghost leaves a trail of breadcrumbs if you know how to look at the metadata." The forensic accounting skills she had honed in the shadows of her father's neglect were now her greatest weapons. She navigated through layers of offshore encryptions, tracing the siphoned billions from the Veil-Kwon merger. She found the ghost entities, shell companies named after dormant properties and dead relatives, that the Kwon family used to launder the proceeds of their illicit trade. It was a masterpiece of financial deception, but to Seo-Rin, it was a map of their hubris. Dijin leaned closer, the heat of his body a steadying force as she reached the final encryption layer. "If you do this, there is no going back," he said, his voice a low, gravelly reminder of the stakes. "The authorities won't just freeze the merger, they will gut the Kwons and your father's corporation simultaneously. You will be the architect of their ruin." Seo-Rin didn't hesitate. "They were willing to let me be the architect of my own death to hide these numbers," she replied, her finger hovering over the final command. "It's time the world sees the truth behind the wedding of the century." With a single, decisive keystroke, Seo-Rin initiated the leak. Encrypted packets containing years of money laundering evidence, fraudulent tax filings, and the dead notary records were bypassed through secure servers directly to the desks of the Federal Financial Crimes Division. The ghost accounts, were suddenly bathed in the harsh light of a global investigation. Almost instantly, the wall of monitors in the study began to flicker with breaking news alerts. The Kwon family's stocks plummeted into a freefall as federal agents began synchronized raids on their primary offices. The merger, the very thing that had justified her sale, was dead before the morning sun could hit the Han River. Seo-Rin leaned back, her breath escaping in a long, shaky exhale. The gilded victim was gone, replaced by the woman who had just checkmate two of the most powerful families in the country. She looked up at Di-jin, whose ice-blue eyes were burning with a new kind of fire, not just the protective instinct of a captor, but the profound respect of an equal. "The merger is dead," she said, her voice finally steady. Di-jin reached down, his thumb tracing the defiant line of her jaw before tilting her face up to his. "And the woman who killed it is just getting started," he murmured, his gaze promising a future that had nothing to do with transactions and everything to do with power. The digital storm Seo-Rin unleashed had finally settled into a quiet, cold reality. Beyond the reinforced glass, the city lights of Seoul continued to twinkle, indifferent to the fact that two of its most powerful dynasties had been hollowed out from the inside. Inside the penthouse, the air was still, no longer charged with the frantic energy of an escape or an attack, but with the weight of a definitive ending. Seo-Rin sat at the mahogany desk, her fingers resting on the edge of a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a marriage certificate, and it wasn't a merger agreement. It was a new contract, a formal alliance drafted in her own hand, written in the language of a partnership that the world she came from would never understand. She was no longer the bride for sale. She was the architect of her own fate. Di-jin stood by the window, his reflection in the glass a somber ghost of the man who had locked those elevator doors only days ago. He turned as she picked up a fountain pen, his ice-blue eyes unreadable but focused entirely on her. He didn't speak as she signed her name at the bottom of the page, the ink dark and permanent against the cream-colored vellum. She slid the paper across the desk toward him. "This isn't a merger of bloodlines or offshore accounts," she said, her voice steady and clear. "This is a partnership of equals. You provide the fortress, and I provide the mind that keeps it untouchable. I am not your doll, Di-jin. I am your strategist." Di-jin walked toward the desk, his presence filling the room. He looked down at the contract, his gaze lingering on her signature before he picked up the pen. He didn't hesitate. With a few swift, sharp strokes, he signed beneath her name, binding his empire to her intellect. He set the pen down and looked up, the predatory stillness of his face softening into something that looked like a terrifying, newfound devotion. "I didn't want a doll, Seo-Rin," he murmured, his voice a low, resonant vibration. "I wanted someone who could look at the world and see it for the theater of lies it is. I wanted you." He reached across the desk, his hand covering hers. The heat of his palm was no longer a claim of ownership, but a seal of the alliance they had just forged. Seo-Rin looked at her hand beneath his, the bruises on her wrist now faded into pale shadows, replaced by the heavy, shimmering weight of the diamond ring she had chosen to keep, not as a mark of a wedding she fled, but as a trophy of the war she had won. She stood up, the black silk of her hanbok flowing around her like a dark river. She walked toward the glass wall, looking out at the city she had once feared. Beside her, Di-jin took his place, his shoulder brushing hers as they stood together at the edge of the world. The wrong elevator had brought her to a height she had never imagined reaching, and as the first light of a new morning began to touch the horizon, Seo-Rin Vale realized she wasn't just staying, she was reigning.